So anyway, welcome. Okay, now I can focus. My name is Helena, and I'm glad you guys have decided to join me today. So what I want to talk about today is something that I hear abuse survivors say all the time. They say things like, I'm out of the abuse now, so why aren't I happy? Or I thought I would be better by now. What is going on? And so many women talk about still feeling worthless or insecure or feeling empty inside, feeling like they get triggered really easily, feeling like they have anxiety about making decisions and being alone and not trusting themselves. And, that awful anxiety about missing out on life and anxiety about parenting and just so many other things. In fact, in my Confusion to Clarity Facebook group, here are a couple of things that women have said recently. Positive thinking and meditating on God's word and who I am in Him isn't working. It's just so hard to hang on to and nothing seems to stick. And another woman said, I often feel like because I know so much and I'm aware of what's going on, it's my fault that I'm not constantly getting better. I make some progress and then something occurs and I fall away from whatever good I've managed to accomplish. Doesn't that sound familiar? Oh, it's just so hard. There's another person who wants to join. Let me let them in. It's not working. That is so weird. I can't seem to let them in. There we go. Okay. So basically, we just really feel so often that we don't feel like ourselves when the abuse is over. And we try everything we know. But it just feels like this bike chain that keeps slipping off the cogs. And we feel like we can't get a grip on who we are and get a grip on our life. And then over time, all that shame and self-condemnation just overwhelms us because we think that this is happening because there's something wrong with us, or we're afraid that we're just broken for good. And then we end up in this battle with ourselves. And it's just such a painful place to be. I know if I sent out a link to my healing story, it's a video that I made. And if any of you watch that, you know that that's what I went through. That was my experience. I mean, I have prayed all the time. And Jesus really did do a lot of wonderful things in me. There's just no getting around that because that's who He is. He's so wonderful. And also I was in talk therapy, but I couldn't understand why I was still struggling so much. I mean, I had undone a lot of lies, but deep down, I just wasn't at peace with myself or in my life. And I just remember thinking, why is this so hard? Why can't I just find some peace? And saying, Jesus, why won't you just fix me? Oh, that was just like my prayer all the time. Well, if you're feeling this way, I want you to know you are not the problem. You do not need to be afraid of yourself. You don't have too little faith. You're not in sin. That's not what's going on. This is not a moral failing on your part. This emotional instability that we feel, the aftermath of abuse, it happens because there's so many things that happen to us during the abuse. The abuse just causes this deep earthquake at this core level of our self. And it changes our whole view of the world in so many ways. But because of this earthquake at this core level of our self, we feel like we've lost our inner resources. We've lost our inner self because we weren't able to manage the abuse. But see, nobody can manage abuse. Nobody has the inner resources to manage abuse. It wasn't a fault of ours. It was absolutely nothing about us and our ability. The abuse was completely about him. And so it's important to know we actually do have these inner resources still, even though we feel like we don't. The other part that's going on is that we are still dealing with this unhealed trauma from the abuse. And that unhealed trauma is what makes it really hard for us to regulate our emotions. It's what leaves us so easily triggered. It leaves us with all this anxiety and feeling disconnected from ourselves and despair and emptiness and all those symptoms. Because, see, while we're being abused, our body gets stuck in a trauma reaction state. This isn't a choice, it's a survival mechanism. But after we leave, that trauma state is still continuing because our body and our brain got dysregulated from the abuse. So we end up being like an engine that's either stuck, completely revved up all the time, or an engine that we just can't get started. Those are the two ways that we get dysregulated. And so this thing that's going on in our body and our brain is very real, and that is affecting our thoughts, and that's affecting our emotions. That's why we feel like we don't have control over our thoughts and feelings, because actually we don't when they're originating in trauma, unless we've healed that trauma. So a woman in the community posted recently, I had a positive interaction with my soon-to-be ex yesterday, but this morning I woke up anxious and nervous. It's like my body has recall around all the old patterns. Yep, that is exactly right. Her body does have recall around those patterns, and it gets triggered really, really easily. And we're living in that state all the time after trauma. So I don't know if you're familiar with Bessel van der Kolk. He's one of the good, I see some nods. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He's one of the leading researchers on trauma in the world. And here's a quote from him. He says, trauma stress has little to do with cognition. It emanates from the emotional part of the brain that's been rewired to constantly send messages of danger and distress, with the result that it becomes difficult to feel fully alive in the present. This is not about something that you need to figure out or think. This is about your body having been reset to interpret the world as a terrifying place, and reset to interpret yourself as being unsafe. It has nothing to do with cognition. You can say, or like I can say to you, you shouldn't feel that way, or you're not a bad person, or it wasn't your fault. But as Bessel says, a traumatized person will say, I know that, but I still feel like it. That is the trauma in our body.
Thank you, baby.
So for many of us, we can't unrev or start that engine with our thoughts. We have to do it by very gently getting our body and brain regulated again and healed from that trauma and back to our calm state. Now, there is a percentage of women who can leave an abusive marriage and go through grieving and use positive thinking and renew her mind and move on and rebuild her life. And I mean, that's awesome. But most of us develop some, trauma symptoms and potentially the PTSD after abuse. In fact, with narcissistic abuse survivors, 90% have trauma symptoms and 75% develop PTSD. So we need the level of care that matches the level of injury that we've had. I muted myself by accident. Okay. So unfortunately, a lot of therapists, and most definitely most of the church, does not yet understand trauma. I mean, in the world of psychology, it's relatively a new field, like 20 or 30 years old, which is unfortunately still new in psychology. And so they don't understand that there's a difference between our brain and our mind. And that's so very true. in the Christian world. And they don't understand that our brain influences our mind and our thoughts and our feelings. So after my abuse, I had a broken brain. But nobody in Christianity understood this. And I had PTSD, but I was getting blamed for my responses that were coming from my PTSD. I mean, that would be like telling a war vet that his startle reflex when he hears a car backfire is sin. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. It's not sin. Our responses are not sin, they're trauma. This is like my passion, is to get this message to the Christian world. So we stop getting blamed for this after being abused. But what I really started to realize is, how could the church know how to help me heal from abuse when they hardly even acknowledge the abuse to begin with? At least that was my experience. That's most of the women that I deal with experience. If your church has handled your abuse well, I'm really, really happy for you. But that's a rare experience. So we really need more than prayer to heal from trauma. And we certainly don't need to be told to repent for our part in the abuse and that that's going to magically fix us. We had no part in the abuse. It was all about the abuser abusing us. So what we need is a path to healing. So that's why I have Arise, the healing membership community, where it gives a guided healing journey for our heart and our mind and our emotions and our spirit, but also for our brain and our body to get regulated again. And I teach these incredibly powerful tools that help the brain get regulated, help the body get regulated, so we can start managing our emotions, so that we can actually heal the trauma. And then it's so much easier to renew our mind, to undo the lies, and to be able to walk in the truth, which is really what we want, right? Is to walk in truth. So I want to go over with you some of the things that we need to heal. First of all, we need to understand how the trauma has affected us personally, how it's affected our brain and our body, as well as our thoughts and our emotions. And then we need to learn specific tools for calming down our trauma reactions, for calming down the triggers, so that we can learn to regulate our emotions and stabilize our inner world and the dysregulation that's in our body and brain. And these tools really work. And recently in our Arise community, a woman posted this. She said, I woke up at 3 a.m. and I was feeling restless and triggered. I used a tool and my trigger went down and I went back to sleep. I'm so grateful for a decent night's sleep. Thank you for the tools you're teaching us. These tools really do work. It's just so fun to watch how women are using them and the changes that they're getting. It's awesome. So some other things that we need are to reconnect with ourselves and to create emotional safety with ourselves in our relationship with ourselves, because that is something that's been completely broken. And then we also need to become our own hero by connecting with our inner strength, by connecting with our courage, by connecting with what's right with us. And there is so much that is right with us. And then by knowing that we can rely on ourselves, as of course, as well as Jesus. So we build on our strengths, and that ends up meaning that we're building on the very things that the abuser exploited in us. Things like our trust, our tenderheartedness, our compassion, our loyalty, our dependability, our commitment. We get to take these strengths of ours and turn them toward ourselves and use them for our healing. It's a beautiful thing to know that you can rely on yourself because you start seeing who you are. Then we also need to reconnect with those inner resources that we think that we've lost, that the abuser convinced us we're gone, or that the whole situation of abuse convinced us we're all gone, because they're there. We also need self-care that's very specific for trauma. Goes way beyond hot baths. And I do love hot baths, but that's not going to heal your trauma. And we need healing if we're still involved with, or still, stuck in a trauma bond, if we still have cognitive dissonance going on, we need healing with that. And we need to learn how to have compassion on ourselves. That there's actually a process we can go through that teaches us self-compassion, so we can release ourselves from all that self-blame and that guilt and the regret and all the other stuff that can haunt us after abuse. Then we also need to build up our self-worth and undo these lies that we've believed. We need to learn how to set boundaries from that place of self-worth rather than a place of fear or that desperate need to protect ourselves. Boundaries from self-worth are much easier to set. They're beautiful, and they don't come from a place of fear and panic. And then we also need to learn how to process our feelings, because we have very real feelings, all that grief, all that betrayal. Oh, there's somebody else who wants to come in. It's not working. I don't know why. There we go. Oh, okay, thank you very much for telling me that. Okay, so I was talking about the real feelings that we have. We have trauma stuff, but we have real feelings too. I mean, our hearts have been broken. They've been devastated. We have tremendous grief and betrayal that we need to process and heal from. Then, of course, we need healing of the spiritual abuse that we've been through. And of course, we want to find that real connection to Jesus that will sustain us and just take us through everything. And eventually that leads us to finding a purpose and meaning for our life again. And then we get to live in joy because our life has meaning. So all of this needs to happen within a safe community as well. And research has shown that there are certain things that need to happen in a community. And when those things are happening in a community, it helps us feel safe. And it also can help us heal from trauma. And some of those things are really being heard and seen by the people around us. Feeling that we're held in somebody else's heart and somebody else's mind. Really feeling safe from feeling shamed or criticized or judged, obviously. And then, being bolstered by others to face and process what's actually happened to us. And of course, being treated with compassion and understanding. And I can tell you that in Arise, that's what we do. That is the tone that we have in our community. It's a beautiful thing. So today what I wanted to do is give you an overview of the healing. And know that if you feel like you're stuck, there really is a way out. I can't give you some specific tool right now that will heal you, because healing is a process. And there are a lot of moving parts that need to work together. That's why I kind of went through a bunch of what they are. I have taught some tools for anxiety. I taught them in the last meeting that we had together last month, right after the lockdown or the quarantine. And also there's a few tools on my website, the Confusion to Clarity Now. There's a blog post called the PTSD Emergency Survival Guide, and it has some tools that can help with anxiety in the moment to calm you down. But the healing process is a much broader process than just those specific tools. And, it's just not like a one-time event. But there can be really beautiful breakthroughs in the process of healing. In fact, in one of our recent online Arise gatherings for the members, we meet online regularly. One of our members kept leaving the meeting and coming back and leaving and coming back. And she explained that she was having panic attacks. and she just like had to get off. And she said she felt like her soul was completely broken. She was in a really, really hard place. So I said, hey, let me coach you right now. So I coached her through a tool that we have for panic and anxiety. And in Arise, what I teach my members is that, before you use a tool, you give a number to your whatever feeling you're having, like 10's the worst, and, 0 is your perfect peace. And so when we started, she said, her anxiety and panic was at a 9. So I went through this tool with her. It took 5 minutes, and her anxiety went down to a 3. And then later that evening, she posted in our community, and she said, thank you so much for today, Helena. I think my soul came back from being broken. This makes me want to cry. I went on a drive afterwards, and I actually noticed nature instead of being stuck in my head. And then, for the first time, I actually felt loved by God. I haven't felt that since 2011. I mean, I was just sobbing when I read that. That is just exactly why I do this. Because that's what we all need. That's what we all want and need and should have access to. So another woman said recently, I had counseling for 3 years before I joined Arise. I've been healed and set free in so many ways, but I still felt blocked from actually living free. I've been stuck, and Arise is a godsend. The aspect of body and brain is the missing link. I thought it was all in my mind and I was just being stubborn, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't seem to move on with the next steps that my counselor would suggest. So I quit seeing her and I was at a standstill until Arise. And now I know that more freedom is possible. A huge burden has lifted from feeling guilty and ashamed that I was stuck. And that is really like the message I want to give you today. If you're feeling stuck, it is not your fault. I know you are doing your best in a really hard situation, and I know you did your best in an impossible situation when you were being abused, or if you're still in the abusive marriage. But I also know that God just loves you so deeply, and he wants you healed. And I know that the abuse has blinded you to who you truly are, just how beautiful and amazing you are. And I know it's possible to heal. And that's just what I wanted to tell you today. So now we can share. There's a question in the chat box, and if you want to use